Hey everyone, welcome back. So it's been a little over a week now since Path of Exile 2 came to early access. I spent about 100 hours with the game now in total, spread amongst a few characters, but most of my time on my witch, with whom I've started working my way through the end game, pushing myself up to the tier 15 maps, desperately trying to cap resistances, and for the most part failing to avoid being one-shot about every other run along the way. While the game still certainly is in need of some work, additional content, more fine-tuning, and quality of life fixes, one thing is abundantly clear to me now that this is already a fantastic game, even in its unfinished early access state. As a side note, can I just add that looking back on 2024, I've realized that most of my favorite gaming experiences this year have been via early access titles. Just goes to show you that a game doesn't even need to be technically complete to be thoroughly enjoyed. It just needs to be good. I'd rather have an incomplete game that is really fun and keeps me playing than a completely finished, unentertaining, bad game that I put away after a day. But anyway, that's another topic for another video. But yes, the rumors you have heard are in fact true. Path of Exile 2 is a very, very good game and may in fact go down as one of the best ARPGs ever. Time will of course tell. We'll have to see what the next 12 months and coming years turn out to be. But in the meantime, if you're looking for something that is fun to play right now and you enjoy ARPGs, you really can't go wrong with Path of Exile 2. I am $30 down, 100 hours in, and show no
God, I really need to fucking, like, put those little bars above your head. That would help me so much.
Signs of stopping anytime soon. This game will certainly be keeping me busy for at least the rest of the month, if not into next year at a minimum. All right, so I'd like to start off the review with doing a basic overview of the game. I will keep this brief, as I suspect a lot of you already know much of this stuff, but for those who are unaware, here's what you can expect to see and do in Path of Exile 2. So right now, the game consists of 3 completed campaign acts. After picking your class, you will go through these, which on your first run should last somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 30-ish hours, give or take. The first impression that this campaign makes, by the way, is quite substantial. I mean, I really enjoyed my initial playthrough. The tone, the setting, environments, the difficulty and pacing of combat, the boss fights, the loot drops, at least after an early patch, and the overall character progression. Just playing this game, the entire package, it all really comes together nicely.
I never had loot drop issues even before the patch hit. I was having fine loot dropping, but it is better now.
You'll move through a variety of environments and locations. You got beaches, fields, caverns, woods, castles, dungeons, temples, jungles, deserts, and graveyards, just to name a few. All along the way, battling through hordes of enemies while working on main and side story quests and coming head to head with a host of interesting and difficult boss encounters, with there being one major boss fight located in each of the game's individual areas. I believe as of yet, we're looking at about 50 total unique bosses. There are quite a few unlocks and challenges along the way as well, various side bosses and quest objectives that reward permanent buffs to your resistances, your character stats, and even skill points. And then there is your ascendancy trials, which you will encounter in the campaign initially. These are fairly difficult challenges you must complete in order to unlock points for your class ascendancy, which we'll get to later on here. Now, once you've completed the initial campaign playthrough, you actually run it back. This time on the cruel difficulty, going through the same 3 acts a second time, but now against more challenging enemies. Now, this structure is a placeholder for the early access launch come full release, which is happening in 2025. We will be getting an additional 3 different acts for a total of 6, but in the meantime, yes, you are playing through the first 3 acts 2 times. In the second run, it is much quicker than the first. I think I actually completed it in a single afternoon, you know, given the fact that I know the boss fights, the quest objectives, and just have a better sense of the game. I'm better at playing at it. My build's better. It just all really cut the playtime down substantially for that second run. Yes, the difficulty was technically higher, but frankly, in practice, everything felt easier and the process went smoother. Now, after your second run, you're going to get a few new sequences upon defeating the Act 3 final boss, at which point it is time to start the end game. Now, bulk of the end game consists of what is referred to as mapping. This has you moving through this overworld atlas, completing maps, which are procedurally pieced together dungeons of sorts of all of the areas and locations that you explored in the campaign. From your starting position at the Ziggurat Refuge, you will progress outward, moving from one node to another or one map to another, attempting to complete each of them successfully, collecting loot and progressing further through the atlas in the process. So
in concept, that sounds cool as fuck, because I like killing mobs, man. Like, I love killing monsters, man. I just like clearing maps. I love clearing entire zones of monsters. I personally am the target audience
So a majority of the current endgame systems are all accessed and engaged with here in the Atlas and going through this mapping process. Now, not only do these maps vary in their environments, the locations, and layouts, but there are also many types of content that you can choose to interact with in them as you please. So maps start off at tier 1 and then go up to tier 16 with increasing modifiers, more challenging enemies, lowered resistances, and some variety of events and activities that you can find within. These include things like Ritual, where you'll interact with a number of altars around the map, fighting off waves of enemies at each. There's Delirium, which has you fighting off as many monsters as fast as possible to build up your meter. If you do this quickly enough, you can even spawn a boss fight. There is Breach, where you open up a breach to another dimension and have to fend off an insane amount of enemies. There's Expedition, where you have to place where to put your bombs, these explosives at this excavation site, which opens them up, having you fight enemies but collecting rewards in the process. And then there is straight up bossing, where some of the maps will actually contain a boss fight of which you played through in the campaign. You got to fight the boss again. This even has its own skill tree associated with it. In fact, all of these endgame activities have their own skill tree through the Atlas progression tree. So the process of mapping, the process of the endgame, basically has you going to one of these nodes. You'll start off by placing a tier 1 waystone, and that waystone essentially determines the level and difficulty of the enemies you fight inside. Then you go in, you will move through the map, clearing its enemies. Your main goal is actually to kill all of the yellow elites, or whatever they're called. In doing so, if you do this without dying, it makes for a successful clear of the map, which then lets you move to an adjacent node, progressing further through that overworld Atlas. And then you also have many side events and objectives, the ones that we just covered, and some of these maps will contain those, and you can choose to engage with them or not. Doing so will give you additional loot, currencies, and then really also one of the things you're mostly after is trying to find higher tier of waystones, which lets you progress further, because as you go through the waystones, the challenges...
See, compared to the other video, I like this a lot more because I'm getting a better picture being painted here.
Just get harder, but it gets you closer and closer and closer to that pinnacle endgame content. Also, all throughout the Atlas are these special tower nodes. Now, these are smaller maps that, when completed, will actually reveal the additional surrounding nodes in the area on your map. Also, once cleared, you can actually insert what are called these precursor tablets, which will enhance a number of nodes in the surrounding vicinity. These can add things like increasing enemy levels, the loot drops, player experience rewards, or even adding additional events. Like, for example, if you want to play Delirium, if you happen to like that endgame activity, you can find these Delirium precursor tablets, put them into a tower, which will then add Delirium events to a number of those adjacent map nodes. Now, beyond mapping, the other two pieces of endgame currently are the Ascendancy trials. These are fairly difficult challenges that you have to complete in order to unlock skill points for your chosen class ascendancy. A class ascendancy is basically like a specialization for your class. So for example, the main class that I'm playing, the Witch, she's focused sort of on the occultist tree, and you're summoning minions and laying down curses and things like that. But you can focus, the one that I'm playing as is the Infernalist, and it's fire focused. You've got a demon form. There's an alternate resource that you can activate, or just increase your overall health and tankiness, get a little Hellhound companion. And there are right now 2 ascendancies for each of the 6 classes. Eventually there's going to be a 3rd ascendancy, and we're also getting 6 more classes throughout the course of early access, and each of those will have 3 ascendancies. But anyways, the ascendancy is a decision that you're going to make as you're progressing your character, which is going to help you fine-tune your build into a certain sort of theming. And in order to get points for those, while you get normal skill tree points just by leveling up or by those map unlocks, to get the ascendancy points, you have to complete these ascendancy trials. So there are 2 main trials. There is first the Trial of Sekimas. This uses this honor system, which basically means you don't want to get hit while you're playing, while you're going through the trial, by anything at all. So you move through these rooms, and you will either be fighting off enemies or navigating some sort of a maze full of traps. Your main goal is to just take as little damage as possible the entire time, because damage taken translates to honor lost, and when your honor level reaches 0, you will fail the run. So the trial is presented in floors broken up into rooms with branching paths that give you some choices along the way. Each one of the rooms will have some sort of a modifier to the challenge. Sometimes these will grant you a bane or a boon, which is either like a buff or a debuff, helping you along or making things more difficult. And then at the end of each floor, there is a boss fight. These fights are different for the 4 floors. They get progressively harder. As of now, we know there are at least 4 floors. There might be more planned later, but that's the highest that I've seen. And then there's also an additional layer of progression for the Trial of Sekimas, where you have these artifacts. Before your run, you can slot them in. When you put your key in, you've got spaces to put artifacts, and they can grant you different bonuses for your trial. These can be things like increasing your move speed or better resistances, but the most valuable things and artifacts you're looking for are ones that grant either increased honor, or most coveted is the honor resistance, which means when you take damage, you will lose a smaller portion of honor, which makes it more likely that you will successfully complete the trial.
Yeah.
All right, so that is the first one. The second one is called the Temple
Honor resistance is definitely the one you want. So everyone's like stacking honor resistance right now.
of Chaos, and this one is more straightforward. You make your way through one of 10 rooms. There is no honor system here, but in its place are some rather severe debuffs that you accumulate as you progress from one room to the next. So once you finish a room, you have to pick from one of 3 choices. All of them are going to be bad. Some of them are less bad than others. You hope for good rolls, you try not to die, and ultimately you're attempting to make your way to the end. And once you reach a certain threshold in both of these
I'd say the Val one is actually worse, personally. Just because, like, getting good RNG on your roll is way more intense.
trials, you are awarded points to spend in your class ascendancy tree. As of now, there are 8 total ascendancy points available by going through these trials. Although it seems like many people are stuck around 4 or 6 points, as progressing enough for those final 2 points right now is quite difficult for a lot of players and a lot of builds. And the real end game basically comes by the time you get to the tier 15 maps, at which point you're probably going to want to start focusing on which of the various modes that you like engaging with. This is when a lot of the outer parts of your Atlas skill tree will open up with specific sections that let you modify maps further, like for the stuff that you like doing. So for example, if you like bossing, you can invest in the bossing nodes, and this will do things like add difficulty levels past the normal tier 15 maps and offer greater rewards for you as a result. Each of the endgame activities that we've covered here has some kind of progression like this. There are also nodes around the map that we still don't even fully understand as of right now, or I don't fully understand at least. Some of these seem to be related to the pinnacle versions of each content type. So I'm talking about things like the Reliquary Vaults, the Citadel, and the Way Gates. I'll have to get back to you on this. I'm 100 hours in. Still no clue what any of this stuff does, which just goes to show you how much content is here in this game.
And it's like not even half of the shit's in the game, too. That's the crazy part.
Rather interesting about the end game in Path of Exile is that max level isn't just a matter of time investment. It's not as simple as grind for 100 hours and you're going to reach level 100. Congratulations. Rather, it comes down to how capable your build is, how lucky you are with loot drops, barring trading with other players. And then, of course, player skill plays a role. It's not just a matter of hitting max level, and hitting that number is something that anyone can reach by putting enough time into the game, because the game actually punishes you quite severely for failing. That's because past a certain level, deaths will start removing experience from your characters. It's something like 10% of your XP bar gets nuked every time you die past a certain level. I don't know which level it is. It's something around 70, I believe. But anyways, at one point,
75.
When you die, you start losing experience. On top of the fact that while mapping, you will fail the map on death, requiring you to use another waystone and rerun it, but that's not as impactful as losing experience. That's more of a nuisance. But because of all of this, you really have to focus. You got to focus on playing smart, you got to be paying attention, and above all, avoiding death as often as possible once you're in that end game. This will mean having to refine your build, tweaking your gear, and just trying to get the most out of your character. But even still, even if you are doing all those things, you may not be able to push past a certain point if you can't get the gear, if you don't have a good enough build, or if you can't hit certain damage and survivability thresholds. There just might be a cap to your progression depending on your character, your build, and you as a player. Now, I can absolutely see this being a turnoff for some, but frankly, I like the challenge. I like the stakes that it creates, and I like the fact that it forces you to put more emphasis on paying attention, playing well, and yes, min-maxing. Of course, this also means that when there are busted builds, people who play those busted builds are going to have an easier time, but nevertheless, the overall experience this creates is one of actual challenge and triumph if you're able to overcome it. It makes things like defeating those endgame challenges.
I think that's fine. I don't think the XP loss is a good thing. I'm just reiterate that.
Like the pinnacle bosses, an actual achievement, even if it is just an achievement of picking the most busted build. It's an actual challenge to overcome, not just a matter of sinking it enough hours. That's basically the main point here, and the part about it that I enjoy. Now, beyond creating or picking a strong build and getting lucky with gear drops, another big element in progression in this game is the crafting. Although it's not what you might expect when you hear the word crafting. You are not taking iron ore, smelting it into bars, and then making a sword from scratch. Crafting in Path of Exile Exile is basically the process of modifying and enhancing the gear drops that you get. For the most part, you're hoping to find these workable pieces of gear that have some good baseline stats, and then modifying them with the game's variety of currencies. These include Orb of Transmutation, where you will upgrade a normal to a magical item, Orb of Augmentation, which will add a second modifier.
I've been doing this a lot lately too. Like, I just got an overpowered weapon like yesterday. I got really lucky.
For 2 magic items. Then there's the Alchemy Orbs, which will upgrade a normal to a rare, Regal Orbs, which upgrade a magic to a rare, Chaos Orbs, which remove 1 affix and replace it with another random affix. There's the Veil Orbs, which will unpredictably add things to an item. This is basically the endgame system of you really trying to min-max your gear as much as possible. The Exalted Orbs are like the primary currency. This is what most people trade with because it will add a new affix to a rare piece of gear, and this is what it's just what you're highly coveted and what you happen to also be lacking the most as you're progressing and as you're crafting. Divine Orbs will randomize the numbers on all your affixes, so if you happen to get good stats but low rolls on those stats, this gives you a chance to get higher rolls. The Orb of Annulment will remove a modifier, and then the Orb of Chance upgrades a normal to a unique, but then can also delete the item in the process. So lots of different currencies, they do lots of different things, but the main point is these fine-tune and help you modify what are good baselines. You get a piece of gear. If I got a chest piece that has like default spirit and then additional spirit and life, I'm going to be modifying it to add things like resistances. That's the general process. All right, so that is the basic overview of Path of Exile 2, the content, the things to do, the things to see. Now let's talk about my general thoughts, the pros and the cons, the likes and the dislikes. Starting with what I like. In general, the gameplay is fantastic. As mentioned last video, I think they nailed the moment-to-moment feel of combat. There was a lot of weight and impact to your attacks with good corresponding animations and sounds, all of which results in great feel to the combat across the board. It's just simply very satisfying to attack things.
I'll say early on, game feel is very till you're about the 30 mode, 30 plus mode for me. At least for playing melee. Playing a warrior has definitely been like, it's like until I hit about 30.
And that's been the case on all of the classes that I've tried thus far. They have done a real good job. One of my biggest complaints of Path of Exile 1 was that I didn't feel that sense of impact right out the gate in combat, but they have delivered it. Level 1, starting with a fresh character with your basic skills, even just basic attacks, there's an oomph to it. There's a heft to it. And I think they did a fantastic job. I also really enjoy the...
It's because of how slow it is. Honestly, that's the reason why.
Slower pacing of the game, at least initially, this was the case while playing through the campaign. Even on the second run of the campaign on Cruel Difficulty, it still had a basically slower pacing. Things definitely speed up though once you start getting to mapping, once you have more of your build online, you start getting better gear and unlock more ascendancy nodes. But even still, I would say like those first 40 to 50 hours, things are on the slower side for sure. And they require you to really pay attention to avoid deaths while boss fights in particular, but even on blue and yellow mobs, like you got to pay attention, you got to dodge stuff, and you got to be very particular with your character positioning, with your ability and attack placements, like all that stuff. At least that was the case for the first half of the 100 hours that I've sunk. Things are starting to speed up already. I mean, at this point, we are already seeing glimpses of things speeding up quite dramatically, in fact, depending on your class, your build, and your gear setup. Just the other day, I saw that clip that was going around of a Flicker Strike monk that if you told me that this was from Path of Exile 1, I would have believed you. Like, he was screen clearing at absurd speeds, far from the slower methodical pace that I initially enjoyed about the game. And I assume that this trend is going to likely continue, probably even getting more extreme going forward. As
I think that's fine though. Like when you're at the end game, like I want to go crazy. Like let me get crazy. I think that difference, that like, oh, you slow methodical build up to, oh my god, I'm God, is really tasteful. It's awesome.
The new classes get unlocked with new weapons and new skills and support skills, and new combinations are found by the community. I assume we're going to get even crazy.
Like my warrior isn't like broken right now, but I definitely can like hit a button and like screen clear. It's nice.
your faster clear speed builds, unless Grinding Gear Games does anything deliberately to rein that in. Although I don't necessarily feel like they have to, I liked the slower pacing of combat that the game initially presented me with, and even though things are speeding up as of now, I think it's okay for them to have a variety of content type, right? Like, I don't think the whole game has to be those first 30 to 40 hours of pacing. In fact, honestly, I think that ideally, the best games are going to have a varying levels of gameplay types when it comes to the speed and the challenge that they present. For example, I think a game that happened to do this very well was Lost Ark. They had a great large variety of content types, and they were played at a variety of paces. You had the very challenging single boss fights where you really had to pay attention to telegraphs and dodge every attack and sneak in your counterattacks when the opportunity presented itself. But then there are other modes where you will go in and you're just, the whole thing is you doing big AoE attacks to clear the entire screen of enemies in one fell swoop. And then there are ones that split the difference, where you've got some fast screen clearing followed by more methodical engagements followed by more fast screen clearing. But then on top of that, having auxiliary stuff and downtime activities, I think, can really add a lot to the entire package. And I mean, GGG even has a little bit of this as well with PoE 2, with things like your hideout customization, basically like base building. If you know, you can like decide where your tree goes and put little ferns and chairs and all sorts of stuff around your base to make it as pretty as you want it to be. Or you've got even things like expeditions, where in the middle of a map where you are screen clearing a lot of the time, you're pausing for a moment to decide, hey, where am I going to link these bombs to explode to get all the proper rewards, but also avoid the worst debuffs that I want, like even just things to break up the action, that otherwise nonstop action. So yes, I think while I enjoyed the slower pacing that I was initially presented with, things have sped up already, and like I said, I assume this is going to exponentially get even faster. But if they can keep it so that there is that variety, there is some slow, like the boss fights maybe, unless you're a monk, and there's some fast and screen cleary stuff, even though it is the case that we are already starting to see things speed up quite substantially, I will still list the initial slower pacing as something that I really enjoyed. Visuals, really great here. I'm super impressed with their graphics and animations.
There needs to be more options for graphics, though. Like, some people's like computers, especially when you're streaming, like there's so much fucking fire effects that my computer just like lags out, man. It's crazy. Like, I need to like turn that shit down. Particle density, like a particle density slider.
Fantastic use of lighting in darker spaces in particular. I just think there's some really good vibes created when you're in these dark dungeons and you've got the light source from your player character or from light sources in the environment. It just looks great. Music is S tier in this game as well, for the risk of getting copyright claimed. Not really going to play it, but I will tell you there are particular maps that are about as close as you could get to pulling from Diablo 2 nostalgia without getting sued, I assume, and I'm all here for it. Like, there was such a pleasant surprise when I went into that zone. I was like, this is Diablo 2 music? No, Path of Exile 2. We're playing Path of Exile 2. Okay. Another thing I've really enjoyed about the game is just the large amount of progression there is to chase. Obviously, you've got your gear drops and all of the modification that you're doing through the crafting system to try to make okay gear to great gear to best in slot gear, and then leveling to get your build as far as you can go to reach its maximum potential. Then you've got the Atlas skill tree that you need to progress, and there's the Ascendancy trials to go through with the Ascendancy nodes, and there's even more to the end game as you keep moving forward, and obviously there's going to be more coming throughout early access. There's just a lot for you to work on and to progress towards, and that's just accounting for like a single character. Never mind like trying to play multiple characters, or if you're someone who's playing hardcore, if you're playing solo self-found, that adds that much more for you to work towards, for you to grind towards. So lots of progression here, and with the game feeling so good to play, it feels good to engage with it and go through that process. I've really enjoyed what I've seen so far of the build and class variety. Now, it does seem like for the most part you only have so many of the top tier builds, but there's just so much. I can already see all of the interesting potential with different skill combos and using the passive tree and the supporting gems and all of that. It's just exciting to know that we are on the cusp of builds in Path of Exile 2 and finding the best builds and the most interesting builds and the fastest builds and the biggest wombo combo builds and the quickest movement speed builds and all that stuff. Like, really can't wait to see the future of this game and the build and class variety, because already I've liked what I've seen. Like, the fact that I started out as a witch thinking I was going to be summoning and cursing, and then I ended up basically as a tank fire mage that had also summon minions. Like, I wasn't planning on that happening. I just like, hey, I like the witch. I'm going to cast some curses and have some zombies. But I ended up yeah, being a tanky fire mage with a one hand and shield, and like I just love it, right? So yeah. And then lastly in the pros here are just the development team. Like it's been crazy. They have been constantly patching the game and taking on feedback and addressing early concerns. I mean, just after the first weekend, like a few days after launching into early access, they released a rather substantial patch that addressed most of the early complaints that I was seeing and just personal pain points that I was having, such as the loot drops, the body blocking issues, the traversal time of maps, which is still going to be patched in the future, and some various major bugs that were taking place that they pretty much swiftly got rid of. They've just clearly been on top of things and tuned in with the community and addressing stuff very quickly, and that's super impressive. All right, now on to some of the points of feedback, concerns, and criticisms, and just things that I hope they address. One, as much as I might appreciate it, the game seems to be a tad on the more difficult side for a lot of people. Now, generally, I think this is fine. Making it easier would likely strip it of a lot of what I'm finding valuable and enjoying about the game, but I do understand that there has to be a level of accessibility, and I think one big problem right now is just that there's a huge chasm between some classes and builds in terms of what they're capable of doing. I mean, just generally speaking, it seems like melee is having a really hard time. The warrior class is really struggling, it seems, just in general. They're struggling to reach the higher tiers. Now, maybe this is changing. The meta is constantly evolving, and maybe as of this recording, a new build is popping up, and all of a sudden warriors are going to be top tier, fastest clear speed and everything. But there just seem to be elements of the game that are tad too difficult for people, and it is on the more punishing side. Now, like I said, I appreciate this difficulty level, but I understand that this is a little too hard for many people, parts of the game. I don't think they should change it with that said, but there you go. And sort of on that same point, the ascendancy system is a little rough. I think in particular, the honor mechanic is just extremely difficult, again, for melee classes in particular. They seem to really be struggling.
I think limiting the attempts on ascendancy is the problem, really. I think limiting the attempts is really bad. It's good that your first ascendancy for each is unlimited. I think it should be like that for all the ascendancies. There shouldn't be a limit or like a chance of like, oh, if you fuck up, you'll lose your thing.
You have a whole mechanic that says, hey, if you get hit and take damage, you lose this bar that eventually, if it gets to 0, you completely fail the activity. Yeah, that whole thing is going to be more challenging for characters and classes that have to be in melee range. Like when I'm playing on my witch, I'm staying as far back as possible. I'm letting my minions do all the work. I'm just casting fireballs and trying to dodge any area of effects or projectiles that come my way. But I'm not required to be in the midst of things to deal damage to kill things, right? My minions are mostly doing the work for me. And so for that reason, with systems like the ascendancy system and the whole honor mechanic, I mean, it's making it very, 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 very difficult for people. On top of the fact that it seems like there's been some bugs where you would progress through the ascendancy to a point that you should be awarded ascendancy points, but you weren't given them for whatever reason, for a bug, presumably. Endgame in general seems a little hit or miss. Like the higher tier maps are exceedingly hard to access, and there are currently just too many one-shots in the game. Even if you are maxed out resistance, you're just getting one shot seemingly out of nowhere. And again, there are just many classes that basically cannot reach that point. Ultimately, in an ideal world, every single class will have one or a variety of builds that can reach the pinnacle of endgame, given player skill and getting the proper gear and get good rolls and crafting it to the point where you want and all of that, right? But right now, that just doesn't seem to be the case. This is partly an early access issue, partly an ARPG issue where there's no like perfect class balance, and there are some classes that are inevitably better than others. But again, ideally, every single class will at least have one or two builds that could reach that pinnacle if given the right player, the right build setup, and the proper gear that player is wearing, right? Crafting is extremely random. As you assumed, we went through how the crafting works, and a lot of times you're just not going to get what you want out of that. And what that ends up meaning is for people who are into trading, you're just better off saving up orbs and then buying the perfect gear for your build from other players. Now, personally, I dislike this. I think it sucks a lot of the motivation of playing and grinding for stuff in these games. If I can just grind for orbs and then use those orbs to buy my bis, it just takes away some of the enjoyment. So I personally rather go like solo self-found, or if I do any trading, it'll just be with drops that my friends happen to get if they want to trade with me.
Yeah, I think clan trading is the extent of what I like to do, really. Or like buying a legendary here and there to like help someone build out their build. Like that's like to the extent of like what I want, really.
Yeah. And then there's some minor nuisances here and there. One big annoyance, honestly, is like the fact that you get a loading screen every time you open the map. I don't know why this is happening. It's something that I hope that they address and fix, because I don't want to see those gears turning every time I open the map. Like, I should just be able to open the map and see the map. I can't remember the last time, actually, that I had to deal with a loading screen to open the map. I don't know what's causing this. I'm sure there's a good reason, and I assume that they're working on it, but I hope they work on it fast, because every time it happens, it's just annoying, frankly. And outside of that, there are a lot of other complaints that are commonly cropping up. You're seeing online, you're seeing other content creators raise concerns and issues about the end game and the progression system, but from what I can tell,
I think the most important thing to remember too is that like around this time during this early access is the best time to complain about things. Like, complaining is good overall.
A lot of these issues are just come down to things like balance tweaking and quality of life improvements. Now, we should be raising these concerns, but I don't really find value in having them in this review, because I expect most of this to be addressed throughout the course of early access. Because again, to me, a lot of the big complaints that have coming up have been down to things like balance tweaking, quality of life complaints, the way the progression ramp up and the difficulty is presented. Other than like just wanting more variety towards the end game, although there is plenty there. Just further going down the path of mixing things up will of course be nice, and adding additional variety on top of what we already have. But in general, I mean, that about does it for my overall cons and thoughts of the game. TLDR of all of this is, the evidence is all out there, right? You can see the user reviews, you take a look at how the game is performing, like it's just doing phenomenally right now. It's been over a week, and the game has basically maintained its peak player count of a bit over 500,000 daily concurrent peak players a week straight after launch. Like, it's doing really, we usually expect a drop to happen almost immediately after the first weekend, but it's been sustaining at such a high number. It's really, really impressive to see. Now, yes, the game is far from complete. We only have half the campaign. There are still 6 more classes and additional weapons to be added. Each of the current classes is still missing 1 ascendancy, and there's clearly a lot more fine-tuning to be done. Also, the end game feels incomplete and in need of fleshing out and balancing. But even with all of that being the case, far from complete or not, what is currently here has been thoroughly enjoyable. I have reached this point where I just don't care if a game is technically finished, if what is here currently is fun to play, entertaining, and keeps me engaged for more than a week. I'm satisfied. Like, it doesn't...
Like, this game has more in it already, and it's not... Like, this game has more in it than D4. There is more in this game than D4, and there's only half of it here. Like, less than half, actually. That's fucking crazy.
Much matter to me that the game will have more content, more classes, and more skills later next year. If I'm enjoying it right now, that's about all I care about. Tomorrow is never a guarantee after all. But anyway, this past week and a half has just been a blast. Like, I'm really enjoying this game, and I suspect I will keep playing Path of Exile 2 for some time to come. But that is all for today. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.
See you, Force.